Good morning, good afternoon, everyone, depending on where you're joining us for this webinar. I'd like to introduce myself. I'm Caroline Bombard, the head of marketing at GeoJunction. I will be your moderator for today, and I'd like to welcome you to our October webinar, Steer Clear of Unnecessary Fines through GeoJunction's Eco Alert Zones. I'd like to introduce you our two panelists, Francesco Altamura, our Chief Business Officer, and Brittany Beagle, Head of Operations. Before we start, I'd like to take you through a couple of housekeeping rules. You'll be muted upon entry. The webinar is recorded and you will be receiving a copy of the slides. If you have any questions, please post them in the chat box and we'll address them at the end. You can also connect with our two presenters, Francesco and Brittany, on social media and LinkedIn. Over to you, Francesco.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everybody, and welcome to a new appointment of our series of webinars about GeoJunction solutions. My name is Francesco Altamura, and I'm the Chief Business Officer in GeoJunction, and together with Brittany Beagle, our Head of Operations, will guide you through one of our key data solutions, the Eco Alert Zones. For this webinar, we decided to change a bit the format. Instead of starting with the history of our company, we'll invest more time talking about our products, our solutions, and focus on the main subject of this event. If some of our attendees want to know more about GeoJunction, the how and why we are rebranded and transformed from A&D, automotive navigation data, about the company's footprint and organization, I encourage all of them to take a look at the past webinars that can be found at the page Webinars and Events of our website. So let's first talk about the GeoJunction product strategy, which is based on three major pillars. Starting with the location-aware content, which is essentially the most traditional part of our offering, with global digital maps, administrative and geo-boundaries, map tile services, addresses, geocoder, and zip code database, including zip+4 in the United States. Then we have the location intelligence services. Here we are not talking about off-the-shelf solutions, but custom data search, data collection and aggregation, consolidation and deployment to enhance the mapping solutions of our B2B customers and create a better and richer user experience for their clients. And last, but not least, the premium location-aware content, well represented from the high alert zones, a suite of data products designed to make roads and people safer and reduce environmental impact. This data suite includes the health alert zones, aggregated information on COVID-19 pandemic statistics with unique and very localized risk evaluation scores across several focus countries, now evolving to contain other health risk areas, such as air quality and noise pollution zones. Then we have the safety alert zones, which are smart polygons, time and weather dependent, around areas with a higher probability of accidents in certain specific conditions, such as tunnels, bridges, accident-prone areas, school and kindergarten surroundings, or playground areas, and many more. And finally, the Eco Alert zones, which are subject of this webinar. They are aggregated information and smart polygons on areas created by local governments to reduce traffic congestion and improve air quality. In this case, GeoJunction plays the role of data aggregator, simplifying the complexity of such information. This means that we collect the data from several complex, unstructured sources. We provide value-added processing and data enrichment and repackage the result in a usable form to serve our B2B customers in several industry sectors and market verticals. So at this point, let's dig into the details of the Eco Alert Zones. First of all, a bit of definitions. GeoJunction Eco Alert Zones data suite contains all existing types of environmental zones, generally divided in two macro categories: low emission and congestion zone on one side and traffic limited zone on the other. Low emission zones can be found under several names, different scopes and characteristics, like low emission zones, ultra low emission zones, zero emission zone, congestion charging zone, and maybe many others. While traffic limited zones are more commonly known as ZTL in Italy or ASIRE in Spain. The concept of the environmental zone started long ago in Sweden in 1996, where the first LEZ, low emission zone program, was initiated. Following the Swedish example, low emission zones have been implemented in several other places, and their number has been and is still continuously increasing, at the point that environmental zones now exist in most of the European countries and in various other countries around the world. Today, thousands of cities have vehicle entry regulations. Entry can depend on vehicle emission level, on vehicle type, payment, and many other complex conditions. To avoid expensive fines and inevitable delays, it's important to check all possible conditions before traveling into those areas. So specifically about low emission zones. They are geographical areas where the access of the most polluting vehicles is regulated or prohibited, with the specific intent of improving air quality and reducing traffic congestion. Usually, this means that vehicles with higher emissions cannot enter the specific area. In some low emission zones, certain vehicles have to pay a fee or a toll if they enter that area. The adoption of low emission zones may favor certain type of vehicles, like alternative fuel, hybrid electric, plug-in hybrid, and full electric vehicles. For example, a zero-emission zone, or so-called ZEZ, is a particular type of low-emission zone, where only zero-emission vehicles are allowed. In such areas, all internal combustion engine vehicles are banned. Only full electric and hydrogen vehicles are allowed, along with walking and cycling and other full electric private or public transport vehicles, generally defined as alternative mobility. Unfortunately, low emission zone requirements are not harmonized across the world, or even across Europe. Rather, the particular LEZs are governed by different local and country level regulation, which of course means an increased complexity to the interpretation of the data. Low emission zone requirement may be applicable to passenger vehicles, light duty vehicles, heavy vehicles, or to both light and heavy vehicles. Most low emission zones also operate 24 hours a day, 365 days a year, but they might be permanent or temporary. Low emission zones are enforced either with camera systems or manually, usually in combination with windscreen stickers. In some zones, it's necessary to register or buy a sticker or a badge before entering. In most LEZ zones, both foreign and national vehicles are effective without distinctions. Some zones are also regulated as congestion charging zones. In such cases, they may limit the access depending on the number of the vehicle plates, so that they can significantly reduce the amount of vehicles traveling into the city. So it's a quite complex world indeed. About the ZTL. ZTL is the acronym of Traffic Limited Zone. That is a name that is mainly utilized in Italy. In some cases, they are also called the congestion charging zone, in particular from English-speaking drivers, or ASIRE in Spain. However, while the primary goal is always to reduce pollution and traffic congestion in the city centers, they are also established to protect and preserve historical areas. Therefore, the aim of such areas is to adapt traffic to the specific urban morphology of the historical city centers. An old town layout can absorb residential mobility. However, it has to be well regulated, as its narrow streets were not designed for a high traffic density. They are usually permanent and accessible only at certain times. In some cases, they might be extended or vary according to major events like festivities, seasonality, and so on. And when active, they can be accessed only by authorized vehicles under specific regulations. ZTL entrance gates are usually controlled through camera system, which automatically detect and transmit the vehicle plates number to the local authorities for verification and enforcement. It's worth mentioning that a rented vehicle is never authorized to access ZTL. Failure to comply with this ban will result in being fined and charged with an administration's fee. So you see here in this slide the current GeoJunction coverage of all our environmental zone, eco-alert zones. As we see, there is a huge concentration in Europe, but there is also presence of such areas all around the world. As of today, we have about 2,000 areas combining passenger and light vehicle zones, heavy vehicle areas, and ZTL areas. In production right now, we have a huge amount of additional area, so that we expect by the end of 2021 to have a database with over 2,500 environmental areas. So I now hand over to Brittany for more technical details and use cases about eco-alert zones.
Yes, thank you, Francesco. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about how do we create the data. So the first step in, as is with most data creation, is we need to first find what we are creating. So we do quite an in-depth sourcing process. So this includes, first we need to find mention of a zone. So that's either through social media, news articles, or a local authority's website itself. Then from that, once we know a zone exists, then we can go into finding the most authoritative source for that zone available. So that's either contacting the municipality itself, or sometimes, if we're lucky, there's readily available, and sometimes there's dedicated websites per zone. However, this is generally not the case. Often we have to dive in quite deep into finding the textual documentation that's been reported by the authorities about the new zone. So generally, it's a textual document that we're finding, that from that document we can then infer the geometry as well as the attributes. So here on the left, we've got a textual example of where we would pull the geometry from. And then on the right-hand side, you see a map there, and that's been provided by the municipality that, so from these two sources, so these are about two different zones, but from these two sources, we can then create the geometry that's needed to create our database. And then also generally through these sources is where we also find the information that we need to create the attributes. We can move to the next slide. So here's just a little bit of an example of how we create the geometry. So the geometry is manually digitized using the source found from the most authoritative source, and then using high resolution satellite imagery. So then we georeference the imagery and make sure that we're including exactly the roads that it talks about and nothing else. That way, if you're using it for a navigation system or something like that, you know when you will be entering the zone and when you will be exiting the zone. And here, I know it's a very big table, very small, so it's just kind of to show you that we have quite a lot of attributes for a zone. So each zone has a specific set of attributes that corresponds to that zone. We include the text in both local language as well as English. So for the instance of multi-language countries, we would include all the languages. So for Belgium, for instance, we've got English, French, and then Dutch as well, not necessarily in that order. We also include the fees and penalties shown in the local currency. Then there's also information in the attributes as well as, the location. So the city center of such and such city, or it is all encompassing within a specific road, things like that. Then we also talk about the activation time. As Francesco mentioned, most zones are active 24 hours a day, but it could be that there are higher restrictions during a certain period throughout the day. So that's encoded in our attributes, as well as the vehicles. That's the most important part, is what vehicles can enter and cannot. And then we also have information about badges, because sometimes, so specifically if you live within an area, generally you would want to have a badge so that you can enter that area without having to pay a fine every time. And then just a few more details about the database itself. So we have a centralized database represented as an API. So we have all of our geometry data as well as attribute data in this API. And we find the API is the best way because the data is it's dynamic. So it's constantly changing and being updated. So that way, getting data through the API ensures that you're getting the most accurate data as possible. And so our geometry is all digitized based on high resolution satellite in WGS84 formats. The data comes as a GeoJSON from the API, and the attributes come as a JSON file in UTF-8 encoding. But if there is a different file format that works best for you, feel free to contact us. We definitely can convert those files into other formats and make something work for you. And yes, as I mentioned, it's a dynamic database, so it's constantly being updated. So regardless of the zone type, all zones are checked on a regular basis. So this could be daily, weekly, it depends on the zone type. The updates are a combination of manual checks and automated checks. All automated checks do go through a QA process to make sure that our automated checks are not creating a false positive. Our temporary zones are also activated separately from our checks of the zone attributes. So the zone activation talks about the temporary zones, the ones that can be implemented in case of a pollution alert. So we do check, we're also checking for new zones because, as Francesco mentioned, this is a ever expanding database, and every country seems to be seeing the need for something like this. For instance, Spain just announced in the last year that they're going to be implementing zones within a certain city size, and that includes about 150 municipalities. So we are monitoring that announcement and when those zones will come to effect, as well as just worldwide. There are some cities in North America that have plans for further in the year or further in the next few years as well. And here I just have a few examples for you to see what the data would look like from the API. So here we have an example of, this is a heavy vehicle zone. So this is in Bologna, Italy. Here you can see the geometry is very detailed and accurate to the satellite. And you can also see that certain roads are cut out from the geometry. This is because this zone does not pertain to those roads. However, if you were, say, driving through this area on one of those major roads and you want to stop, take a break, go into the city, it's good to know from this that if you exit off that road into the yellow area, then the zone restrictions would apply to you. And because this one's a heavy vehicle, it would we have in our database exactly what type of heavy vehicles it applies to. And in some cases, the geometry would also apply to a heavy vehicle as well as a light passenger vehicle. So we have the information for all vehicles that the restrictions apply to. And then here we have a zone in Germany, or two zones actually. So the pink represents a separate zone from the blue one. And you can see it's quite, we're quite accurate to the water boundaries as well. So yeah, we like to keep the boundaries as accurate and as clean as possible. So that way also if two zones are lined up to each other, that there's no overlap. Unless that's, it can happen where there are two zones in overlapping each other, but we make sure that we are being accurate to the documentation, and that only happens when indeed it does happen in real life. So here you can see an example of the text on the side in both English and in German for the name and the description of the two different zones. And here you can see in German they're called, I'm gonna really say this wrong, Umweltzone. That's what they're called in Germany. And so we've translated that to an environmental zone. And then here we have a ZTL zone from Palermo, Italy. So this is what Francesco is talking about, as they mostly are within historical city centers. And as you can see, the ZTL type zones, limited traffic zones, are indeed usually a bit smaller than the congestion zones. And this is because they're really trying to limit the traffic within the main core of the city center. And on the right-hand side, you can see the description of the activation and restrictions, and it's quite in-depth. So from this description, we do also have it coded in a GDF time format with the vehicles that it applies to, so that it all comes out more smoothly than just having to read a big amount of text every time.
Thank you very much, Brittany. Thank you, Francesco. We'll now move on to the Q&A session. I have a first question, maybe for you, Brittany, from our attendees. How frequently is the data maintained and rechecked with local authorities?
So this is something that's being constantly maintained. So depending on the zones, it's either daily, weekly, or monthly.
Okay. The next question, actually this time for Francesco. What is the pricing and business model for this database of Eco Alert Zone?
Yeah, in GeoJunction, we tend to be extremely flexible about the business model and the pricing model, depending on the needs of our customers. Of course, as you can understand, this type of data can be applied to many different use cases in a quite large variety of cases and industry sectors. Of course, the first thing that you have in mind is navigation, in-car navigation or mobile navigation. But there are, of course, specialized applications in transport and logistics, in real estate, for example, a particular case. So depending on the needs of our customer, depending on their business model, we can be extremely flexible in the form we deliver the data, APIs as we said, or raw data in other cases, and as well can be flexible on the business model and pricing model. So it's just a matter to keep in touch with us, and we will find the best possible manner to serve our customers.
Okay, thank you, Francesco, for this detailed answer. The next question is more regarding types of vehicles, and I think that would be more for Brittany. So the questions are, I think it's a double question. Which vehicles types are covered in the data, such as trucks, buses, electric vehicles? And how do you deal with the special permits for the zone, for example, for residents or delivery trucks, etc.? So it's two questions into one.
So vehicle types, I can't list them all because there is quite some. We do code every type of vehicle that is allowed or restricted from the zone. So it can be delivery trucks, people that live within that area, a rental vehicle, a vehicle that pertains to a particular business within that zone, a heavy vehicle, or just a regular car. So it really depends on the zone and what vehicles it applies to. If you're interested, you can reach out to us and get a list of all the vehicle types that we have in our database. It's definitely over 100. I can't give you an exact number, but it's quite a lot. And yeah, we've tried to consolidate it so that we're not duplicating things. So it's a large data set. And I'm sorry, I forgot the second part of the question already.
That's okay. How do you deal with the special permits for a specific zone?
Yes. So in general, most countries have the same type of zone or same type of permit. So we also have that encoded in our database, have a list of permits that are available for each zone, so that it is then encoded into our database and has a mapping file so it'll say basically like badge number 2 is available for this zone. And then you look at our mappings file and say badge number 2 is a resident permit for ZTLs in Italy or something like that. So we do also incorporate all of the different badges per country into the data set as well.
Okay, thank you. The next one is more about coverage. I think, where is the major concentration of eco-alert zones across the globe? Maybe Francesco can
Yeah, sure.
answer.
As we saw from the map, the general map showing the coverage, it is clear that the environmental zones are a specific and important element for most of the European countries. We should actually have some backup slides, right? Brittany, probably let me check. Yeah, I have it one. So let me show this. Hope it is showing now. Yes, on the screen. Mm-hmm. So as you see, as of the end of September, we had almost 2,000 areas, as I said. As you can see now, is divided in low emission or congestion zones for passenger vehicles, for example, congestion zone for heavy vehicles, and limited traffic zones. And you see that there is a high density of congestion zones in Italy, in France, in Germany, much less in other countries. And in particular, in regards of the limited traffic zones, the areas are identified in Italy and in Spain. So this is just to give you a bit of granularity of where the data are as of today. But as we said more than once, these numbers are increasing, and more countries are adopting these type of environmental areas. So we expect by the end of the year to be at 2,500 areas, and during the course of 2022, certainly to increase much more the number of areas as soon as they come in force from the local governments. And by the way, just to comment one more about the type of vehicles, the earlier question. Indeed, there are really many different types of vehicles that are taken in consideration, even depending on the local requirements and government elements that are defined in this regulations. So far, dealing with our customer, we had to consolidate that huge number of typologies into macroscopic categories. So that is what we use to say, even when approached from customer, because there is always a component of customization in this type of database, which need to serve specifically the case of our clients.
Okay, I don't see any more questions. So I'd like to thank our two panelists, Brittany and Francesco, for a very comprehensive presentation, and thank all of our attendees. You'll be receiving the slides and a copy of the presentation shortly, and we look forward to welcoming you on our another webinar soon. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.